For 67 million years, one animal owned the end of the world. That's what we were told. This is a skull that never fit that story. Too small, too many teeth, pulled out of Montana in 1942 and argued about ever since. For nearly 40 years the answer was simple: it's just a baby T-Rex, move on. It wasn't a baby, and it wasn't alone. The proof sat inside 20 tons of rock that almost nobody was allowed to open. This is lost continent, and today we're looking at the dinosaur science erased and the fossil that dragged it back. Stay to the end, because the last question, whether these two animals actually killed each other, still has no answer. It starts with a man digging in the Hell Creek Badlands in the summer of 1942, while the rest of the world was busy with a war. David Dunkel, a curator from the Cleveland Museum, works a skull out of the sandstone and ships it back to Ohio in pieces. What comes out is unmistakably a predator, the same forward-facing eyes as a T-Rex, the same deep jaw built to take punishment. And it is far too small, not damaged, not crushed, just small, incomplete, and wrong. 4 years later it gets a name, a new species of Gorgosaurus, a smaller cousin of the giants that lived further north. And then it sits in a museum drawer for 4 decades, quietly refusing to make sense to anyone who looks at it. Because a small tyrannosaur here is a problem, Hell Creek is T-Rex country, that's the entire identity of the place. So there are only 2 ways out: either you're looking at a young king, or there was a second hunter that nobody had counted. In 1988, 3 paleontologists reopen the case and give the skull a name of its own: Nanotyrannus, the dwarf tyrant. Their argument is written in the bone itself. The seams across the skull look fused shut the way they do in an adult, a small grown-up, not a big child. For a while the dwarf tyrant is real. It gets painted, argued over, printed in books, mounted in museums. And then the tide turns. Through the 90s and 2000s, a new wave of work on how tyrannosaurs actually grow points hard the other way. Because young tyrannosaurs change shape violently, narrow snouts widen into blocks. Blade-like teeth thicken into spikes built for crushing bone. One by one, every strange feature of the little skull gets explained away as a stage of growth, not a species, a teenager. By the mid-2000s, 2 of the 3 scientists who had named the animal changed sides. They argued against their own dinosaur in public. Nanotyrannus was quietly erased. And here's the part nobody could fix. To settle an argument like this, another skull is useless. You can always call a skull a juvenile. What you need is one complete, adult, undeniable skeleton of the small one, and for decades there simply wasn't a body to examine. Then a rancher's cousin, walking a hillside in eastern Montana, noticed a trail of bone fragments running downhill. 2006. Garfield County, Montana. The fragments lead him up the slope to the pelvis of a triceratops weathering straight out of the rock. A local fossil hunter takes over the dig. They cut down through roughly 5 meters of sandstone, and underneath there isn't one animal, there are 2. A triceratops and a tyrannosaur lying hard against it, articulated from skull to tail, with impressions of skin still printed in the stone around them. Nobody in the history of the science had ever pulled anything like it out of the ground. They take it out in blocks. The tyrannosaur alone weighs about 5.5 tons, wrapped in a plaster jacket the size of a small car. And this is where the story stops being about dinosaurs and starts being about money, because it was never a museum dig. It was a commercial one. Under American law, on private land, the fossil is property, and property gets sold to whoever pays the most. New York, November 2013. A major auction house puts it on the block with an estimate of $7 to $9 million. The bidding lasts about 81 seconds. It stalls at $5.5 million, under the secret reserve the sellers had set. No sale, and so the most scientifically valuable fossil on the open market goes into private storage instead, and the door closes. Then it gets worse. The ranchers own the surface of that land. Someone else owns 2/3 of the mineral rights underneath it, which drags everyone into court and forces judges to answer a question nobody had ever needed to ask before. Because if the answer is yes, then every fossil under every ranch in the American West quietly belongs to somebody else. A federal appeals court says yes, it counts as a mineral. The ranchers appeal. The whole question climbs to the Montana Supreme Court. In May 2020, the ruling lands. Fossils are not minerals. The animals belong to the people who own the land they're buried in. 14 years after it came out of that hillside, the fossil is finally, legally free to be studied by anyone. It goes to a museum in North Carolina, bought entirely with donated money. What they paid for it has never been made public. And then a team of preparators starts opening the rock behind glass walls in full view of the street in a job measured in years. Which brings us to the question that had blocked everything for 40 years. How do you prove the age of an animal that died 67 million years ago? You cut its bones open, because a dinosaur's bone grows the way a tree trunk does, laying down a ring for every year it survived. And the rings crowd closer together as growth slows. When an animal finishes growing for good, the outermost layers pack into a dense wall of bone. It's a full stop written from the inside, so they cut into the tyrannosaur from the block, put it under a microscope, and counted. 25 rings, an animal somewhere around 20 years old when it died, and critically, one that had already stopped growing. That single sentence ends the argument, because a T-Rex at 20 years old is not a 5-meter animal. It is a monster in the middle of an explosion of growth. This one was fully grown at roughly 5 meters and under a ton, around a tenth of the weight of the adult T-Rex it was supposed to be a baby of. And the differences stack up on top of that: more teeth in the jaw than a T-Rex, longer arms with real hands that could grip, a different pattern of nerves running through the skull. It was never a child, it was an adult of something else. On the 30th of October 2025, that conclusion is published in Nature by a team led by Lindsay Zano and James Napoli. Nanotyrannus is real, and it lived alongside T-Rex. And the same study goes one step further. A second, smaller skeleton nicknamed Jane, found in 2001, turns out not to match either, so it gets named as a second species. They call it Letheus after Lethe, the mythological river of forgetting, a name for an animal that was written out of the record and then came back from it, which quietly rewrites the last few million years of the Cretaceous. Hell Creek wasn't one tyrant and a landscape of prey animals waiting for it. It was a heavyweight built to crush bone, sharing the same floodplain with a lighter, faster hunter that had grabbing hands and a mouth full of blades. 83 years between that skull coming out of the ground and the science agreeing on what it was. Now the honest part, because not everyone is satisfied and the objection is a good one. If all these small skeletons are Nanotyrannus, then where are the young T-Rex? We should be finding them. Something grew into those 13-meter adults, and right now that stage of the animal is close to missing from the record. And the fossil that started all of this hasn't answered its own question either. Two animals tangled together, but nobody has proved they were fighting. They might have died mid-kill, exactly the way the nickname suggests. Or they might have drowned in the same collapsing riverbank minutes and meters apart and been buried together by accident. In short, for 40 years the science was confident and it was wrong, and the thing that finally corrected it spent 14 of those years in storage because of an argument about who owned it. What else are we getting wrong right now? Because somewhere out there is the specimen that breaks the next certainty, and there is no rule that says a museum gets to it first, instead of a private collector with a bigger budget. If you want to keep pulling the impossible out of the deep past, follow the expedition. The next hunter we're looking at didn't compete with tyrannosaurs, it ate them.